Hi, I'm James, and in this video we're taking a look at this, an item sent through to us by AliExpress to review. The link for this is in the description below, and there is a discount code which they have been kind enough to provide as well. But what this is the Topton Mini PC Gamer, and this features the Ryzen 3 5400U processor, so I was really keen to have a look at this because finding Ryzen 3 based APUs, particularly the U series as opposed to the desktop G series here in the UK, is really not that easy, and this has been my first chance to get my hands on a 5400U. Now we're going to open things up, and I've been a fan of these sort of Intel NUC and similar small form factor machines for a number of years now. When I started this channel originally, I used to do a lot of integrated graphics testing and would use Intel NUCs because they allowed for ease of different configurations and different reusing hardware between systems, and were much easier to work on than similar laptops. As such, this is a slightly larger unit, but in a similar fashion. Now, if we start going through the packaging, we find we have the unit itself here, then underneath we have a quick start and small manual, and then coming through to the section down here we have our power adapter, generic laptop style adapter. They have actually supplied a UK power lead, and then we also have a little sticker which looks to be for mounting purposes, a little Visa mount and the screws for that. We also have a HDMI cable and a SATA cable as well if we're installing a 2.5 inch drive. So looking at a couple of the other small form factor systems I keep, in the middle here we have the Topton Mini PC Gamer, we have the Asus PN50 which I've featured previously on the channel, and we also have an early Intel NUC. And the first thing that we can see is that the form factor compared to the NUC and the PN50 are quite similar. This is slightly larger in terms of actual footprint. So whereas these are around 11.5 centimeters square, or just under 4.5 inches, and same for the NUC. This unit instead is around 15 centimeters square, which is just under 6 inches. By comparison as well, so this is an early NUC without 2.5 inch drive, we can see it's a little taller than that, coming in at just over 4 centimeters, or a bit under 2 inches. So it's shorter than the M2 and SATA PN50, but taller than the M2 only NUC. So overall, still quite a nice small form factor, but it will, if you are looking as a direct replacement for one of these units, will take up a bit more space on your desk. So in terms of specification, the Topton Mini PC Gamer, as supplied, features a AMD Ryzen 3 5400U processor, which is a 4-core 8-thread chip with the Zen 3 Cezanne APU, a 2.6 GHz base clock and a 4 GHz boost clock. This also has AMD Radeon RX Vega 6 graphics, so 6 compute units at 1.6 GHz and 1228 gigaflops of computing performance. Being a bare bones unit, it's shipped with no additional components installed, so we have 2 DDR4 SODIMM slots, 2 M2 2280 PCIe 3.0 4x slots, 1 SATA bay, a M2 E-key port for wireless and Bluetooth module, along with 2 USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 ports, 1 USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 port with USB PD and DP support, 4 USB 2.0 ports, and dual Ethernet ports, one at 1 gigabit per second and one at 2.5 gigabits per second. At the time of recording, this version of the Mini PC Gamer is priced at around £302 on AliExpress, which compares favourably with the PN51, which features the lower specification Ryzen 3 5300U and comes in around £55 more expensive here in the UK, or the Intel NUC 11th generation with i3, which is a dual-core processor with less powerful graphics and again a more expensive price. Topton also offer this system pre-configured with RAM and SSD and options for higher performance processors up to the Ryzen 9 5900HX, although of course prices do increase for these options considerably. So taking a look around the Mini PC Gamer, and we will find on the front we have a USB Type-C along with USB 3.2 ports. These are all reported as being 10 gigabit per second ports, so I will be checking that when I look over the system. We also, I believe, have a small IR sensor here, and then the power button. Turning to the side, and we see on each side we have fairly substantial vents to get airflow through the system. Looking to the back, you can see we have our DC in jack. We also have our USB 2 ports. We also have a HDMI port and display port, along with a 1 gigabit and a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, and finally a headphone jack. Now, one thing that I did notice with the USB ports, which would possibly drive me slightly mad, is that the front USB ports, so on a USB cable we have the USB logo here, which normally faces up. The front, this logo faces up, but all the ports on the rear of the system are actually upside down. So when we go to plug into USB 2 on the back of this, we can see that it's the wrong way up. We actually have to flip it over with the logo facing down. A small issue, but something which would wind people who know about the logo facing up when they're plugging in their USB devices will get slightly frustrated at. Looking at the top, and we have this very reflective finish to it, and this has sort of a almost lattice sort of style graphic on it. There it is just a smooth flat surface. This is just printed onto it. I'd probably have preferred, so the rest of the chassis is a nice sort of grey metal. I might have preferred a similar finish to that, but you can always apply a vinyl to the top if you didn't like that. It's not offensive, but I would normally go for a more uniform finish personally. To get inside the unit, we have 2 screws on the back, which we just need to remove. And then the easiest way to get in is position a suction cup on the top and lift this panel up. You can do it by flipping the unit over and giving it a bit of a shake, but with that lifted off, we are inside and can take a look at what we have. So with the lid off, we can see we have, first of all, our 2 DIMM slots, which we are going to need to install DDR4 3200 modules into. We also have a M2 2280 slot for our SSD, and another M2 slot here, differently keyed, which is for our Wi-Fi or Bluetooth card. If we look at the lid, we find we have our Wi-Fi antennas attached, and we also have the rails for a 2.5-inch hard drive or SSD to be installed there, and the cable for that is in the box, ready to be attached here for SATA and power. That's not all, however. If we are to remove the 4 screws holding the mainboard in place, we can then lift the board out, paying attention to the fact that we have this cable here for the CMOS battery. This is a little tricky just because you don't have a great deal to lift it with, and you have to sort of get some of these ports free. But with the board turned over, we can look at what other connectivity we have, and also the heatsink and cooler. So here we have another M2 2280 slot, so a second NVMe SSD can be installed here. And we also have the cooler, which has a pretty substantial heatsink. One of the key things performance with these APU type processors is keeping them cool and ensuring they can run at higher speeds more of the time, and also potentially higher power consumption. So having this large copper heatsink here with a fairly substantial fan blowing through it is excellent to see. So with the unit now assembled and ready for testing, we have two SSDs installed, a Crucial P2 1TB on this side, and a WD SN550 500GB on the other. We also have a 802.11ac wireless card and two 8GB Crucial Ballistics DDR4 3200 modules. So firing the system up for the first time, and the first thing we're going to notice there is actually quite a lot of fan noise, and this doesn't die down after you boot it up or get into an operating system. And actually the first thing that we're going to do now is take a look at the BIOS on this system, because it is really interesting what has been shipped on here. So normally when you're looking at a retail unit, you would expect a fairly locked down BIOS, and particularly on a small form factor system where you'd expect something more akin to a laptop. And instead what has happened with the Topton Mini PC Gamer is it seems to have just shipped with the reference AMD CRB BIOS for this processor, or this generation of processors. So we find on here a huge number of options. And the first thing we can see is, pleasingly, we have the AMD firmware TPM enabled straight by default. So installing Windows 11, which we're going to be doing shortly, should just be no issue at all. This should meet all the requirements for that. But otherwise, we have a phenomenal number of options in here, and some of them are for things that you just do not need to touch, because in a lot of cases, they're not even things which the product has. So just trying to find an example. We have, so in AMD PBS in here, we have all kinds of options for NVIDIA discrete graphics. We also have options for things like disabling touch panel and touchpad and NFC. And this doesn't have any of these. These are really things that you'd expect the manufacturer to remove or hide from the BIOS before shipping it. And we do have things like NVMe RAID, but when I turned this on, I then couldn't see how to actually set it up. So it's quite a strange product in the sense that they have shipped things with a lot of options that really shouldn't be in here. And it gives you the sense that this is quite a unpolished product in that regard. What we can do, and it took a bit of searching, but we can fix that fan speed issue ourselves. So we can see the fan in here. We can set low temperature, medium temperature, high temperature, critical temperature, and we can adjust the fan speeds for different temperature ranges. So we can adjust this, bring it down so that it is to 10% for low temperatures. And in doing so, saving the BIOS and restarting, we then notice that the noise level decreases dramatically. This is still keeping the fan running, the system is still on, but it means for low load usage it's going to be a lot quieter. And it's really odd that they didn't sort of ship like this from the factory, because as standard the system is a lot more noisy than it really needs to be. So with that done, we're going to insert our Windows 11 installer, restart things, and take a look at the setup process. So setting things up, we're going to restart the system, and booting from our Windows 11 install stick, we get no warnings that our system isn't compatible with Windows 11. It meets all the requirements with the default firmware settings. I'm going to install without a product key and just install the home version for testing. I have reverted to just a single SSD for now because I already had an OS install on one of them and didn't want to affect that. But the system goes through and installs without any issues. And so with Windows 11 installed, we're now going to give it an internet connection. I'm using the Ethernet port and just the gigabit because that is all I have in terms of networking equipment here. And we are going to load settings, go to Windows Update, and allow it to begin finding drivers for the system. And having been through Windows Update, we're then going to restart and see where we stand in terms of drivers. And having done this, we can see that Windows Update has failed to fetch the correct graphics driver and also has left this multimedia controller and PCI encryption decryption controller. Now, Topton's website really gives little to nothing in the way of drivers for the device, so we are going to fetch the latest version of the Radeon Adrenalin driver package for this processor. Installing the AMD Radeon Adrenalin software, along with the AMD chipset drivers to get the AMD PSP driver in place, ensures that all our devices are accounted for under Device Manager and there are no missing drivers. So whilst there is a little more legroom involved than some devices that you might find where all the drivers are covered by Windows Update straight out of the box, at least the lack of support on the Topton website isn't an issue. So using some Windows tools to verify the system's configuration, and we can see that CPU Z here confirms that this is the AMD Ryzen 3 5400U with Radeon graphics. We can see that the level of customization is really basic on this board to the extent where they are just using that CRB BIOS and we just have default string filled in for both manufacturer and model of the board. And we can also see we have some information which may be useful in trying to find a BIOS update for this because the manufacturer or the brand that is selling this board does not actually provide any BIOS updates or drivers through their website that I was able to see on the UK site. Checking the memory, however, we can see that we have dual channel memory and this does run correctly at the DDR4 3200 speeds it is rated for. Bringing up GPU Z, and this confirms that we have the 6 CU, so 384 shader units, and we also have the 51.2 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth because we have that dual channel 128-bit bus. Looking at CrystalDiskInfo, and we can see, so I'm only running with the one SSD fitted currently, but we can see that this device does connect at 4 times PCI 3.0. So, and when I tested with the other in here as well, I could see that both ran at the full 4 times speed transfer mode, so the second drive doesn't run in 3 times. Now, where things get really interesting is if we bring up HWMonitor. And what we're going to do is we are going to load CineBench R23 because the performance of this machine is actually really impressive because they haven't really configured things for it. So if we start the multi-core test, and what we will see here is once the test starts going, this thing goes, first of all, quite loud. You may be able to hear it in the background while I'm talking, but also this thing just goes up to 42 watts. Because this unit is also available with the 5900HX in it, it obviously has a cooler which is specified to meet these kind of power outputs, and they just haven't really toned down the power settings. So although this is a Ryzen 3 5400U, it is going to massively outperform what you would expect from a laptop running the same chip. In fact, when we run it through CineBench R23, it scores higher than I believe it is the Core i7 1165G7 in 28 watt mode. So if you're comparing this to a i7 sort of NUC style machine, you'll find this offers higher performance in this mode. Now, we do have options for constraining that. There are options in the BIOS for reducing the power consumption. Our other option, however, is we can load up Ryzen controller. And this means the BIOS options, we can just set like a flat TDP cap, which is the easiest option. There are ones for doing short-term and long-term power settings, but these take a lot more understanding and aren't quite as intuitive as you might think if you can find them. But using the Ryzen controller, we can just say we want to straight up either limit the temperature, which will in turn limit the noise. So here we are going to limit the temperature, and we were going to see it should pull down the power usage, trying to reach that temperature that we've aimed for. So this still running CineBench in the background will drop down that power usage to around 20 watts, trying to get the temperature down to 70 degrees. We can also say that we want actually to cap the processor to 15 watts of power consumption, and that will immediately bring that into range. We can then also set long and short TDP levels. So we can say for short amounts of time, say up to 60 seconds, we want to allow it to use 40 watts, 25 watts up to 900 seconds, and then down to 15 for sustained tasks. And doing this will then give us very, very high performance for sort of bursty workloads, and then bring the temperature more into line to what we expect when we have longer tasks. Testing with CineBench R23 at 15, 25 and 37 watt TDPs, we can see that the performance improves as it's completing the image quicker with increased power consumption, and that is because at 37 watts it can sustain 3.9 GHz, 25 watts 3.6, and 15 watts just 3 GHz across all 4 cores and 8 threads. Now, I think 25 watts is probably a good trade-off on this particular chip because the system gets less loud, less hot, and will sustain that pretty easily without ramping that fan speed right up. So I would probably opt for the 25 watt mode for running this chip in this chassis, but it is nice to have the options. And it's really good that Ryzen controller gives you the flexibility there. So you could say for office operation, have the system set up to run at 15 watts, but for gaming or high performance situations, toggle it up to 37. Of course, despite being called the Mini PC Gamer, gaming performance is going to be limited by the fact that we only have this integrated graphics with the 6CU AMD Radeon Vega core in here, and also DDR4 3200 MHz in a dual channel configuration, as opposed to faster LPDDR4 or GDDR on a dedicated graphics chip. But we do consistently get over 30 frames per second in Forza Horizon 5 at modest detail settings with 1080p but balanced render scaling and low detail preset. And this actually bears out in gameplay as well, so playing through one of these scenarios here, and frame rates were very much over 30 frames per second throughout the run. If I wasn't playing this through the capture card, I would probably have chosen to VSync it to lock it to 30 frames per second most of the time. And while you're going to struggle in sort of very fast cars in this kind of setting, for the lower performance cars in the game, you shouldn't really struggle. But when you're dealing with cars that will do 280, 300 miles an hour, you're probably going to want something that can deliver a consistent 60 frames per second or higher. But overall, fairly impressive that the box, considering it is such a compact and relatively inexpensive unit, can play Forza Horizon 5 this well, and being based on the AMD Ryzen APU with Radeon graphics, compatibility and performance on the whole should be better than what we would expect from a small form factor system based around Intel's Iris Xe chips. While these can have very solid performance, I generally believe that AMD's driver development is ahead when it comes to general game compatibility and overall performance. Iris Xe, best case, can outperform it, but it relies on the Intel drivers working well. So overall, what do I think of the Topton Mini PC Gamer, and would I recommend it? Well, first of all, it is really good to get our hands on a Zen 3 based APU, and the 5400U does not disappoint. Obviously, the performance of it was somewhat impacted by the very high power restrictions that the Topton Mini PC Gamer gave to it, allowing it to run way above the TDP you'd normally expect, imbued it with some very strong performance, but it is nice to have those options as well. I also feel it represents really good value for money, coming in at approximately £300 here in the UK with the discount code in the description, and for a 5400U based NUC, that is very good. There are also options for it to be pre-configured, which obviously drives up the price. I found it more cost effective to go with a bare bones unit and set it up as I wanted it, but that is an option for those who need it. Although not something I was able to test, the inclusion of 2.5 gigabit per second Ethernet is also going to be a real bonus for some users. 1 gigabit Ethernet is not particularly fast these days, and if you're dealing with large files and have the networking equipment elsewhere in your setup to accommodate this, it's a useful feature to have. The system BIOS, however, is definitely more of a mixed bag. As it arrives, the system definitely lacks polish. It's too loud. The power settings will not be suitable for all users, where you may want to be using this in office environment where you prefer low noise, or you may be wanting that performance. But having so many options in the BIOS is great for enthusiasts, but a lot of them are not relevant to this unit and should just have been hidden or removed. Likewise, for those who just want a mini PC to plug in and run, this does require an element of tweaking that may not suit them. The integrated graphics as well is definitely more suited to sort of indie or slightly older gaming titles than it is modern AAA, while AMD's Radeon Vega 6 integrated graphics is one of the better solutions out there in terms of overall performance and compatibility. It lacks the punch of some of their larger integrated graphics chips, and maybe a little bit memory bandwidth limited as well. So for a product which is selling as a PC gamer product, do just bear that in mind if you're expecting pure gaming performance from it. Onto the negatives, and the rear USB ports being 2.0 speed only is a definite downside for me. It would have been really nice to have at least a pair of USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports or Gen 2 on the back there. While it's nice having 10 gigabit per second on the front, it would be nice to have some at the back as well, because you don't always want to plug your high-speed devices into the front of the system. And probably my biggest concern with this is just as a one-off buyer, the lack of support, because the Topton site simply doesn't have anything in the way of driver downloads or BIOS updates that I could find. It does look like they accommodate to larger orders where you can have some customization of the device with logos and some custom design elsewhere, but as a one-off purchaser, you're not going to get a great deal back from the manufacturer in terms of support, I suspect, and certainly getting those updates may be difficult. So overall, is this a recommendation? Well, I really enjoyed playing with this. As someone who used to work with customer reference boards in his day job, it was actually really nice to go back to playing with something which has so many BIOS options. And for an enthusiast, yeah, that's going to be really interesting. For a general user, though, who doesn't have the experience or the know-how to really start tweaking these things, okay, you've got the option of using Ryzen controller, but you shouldn't really be relying on that. So for the average user, you're going to want to get the BIOS settings right. And if you're selling this to someone, then even if you pre-configure the BIOS, if they reset those settings, you're going to have to do it again because the defaults just aren't really right. So if you're buying this into an office environment, I would possibly say you want to continue looking at your Intel NUCs, your Asus PN50 or PN51, or even things like the Dell Optiplex small form factor systems. But if you're an enthusiast user who is willing to compromise on some of that polish and wants a Zen 3 APU, and to have just that range of choice of how you configure the machine, I'd be really tempted to say, yeah, go for it, get one of these. So all that's left to say is thank you for watching. I realise this has been a long video and I've tried to cover as much as I can, but obviously there will be questions that people have which I have missed. So if you have any of those, do ask them in the comments below. Hit like if you found this video useful, and subscribe to see more content from our channel as we post it in the future. Obviously, I've got to say thanks to AliExpress for providing this sample unit. Do visit the link in the description below to see it for yourself. There are options for different processors and different customizations for these when you order, and do use the code BREWComputing for $20 off a $200 spend. So once again, thanks for making it all the way to the end of this video, and have a great day.